I'm Angela Cummings. I'm the executive director of our Illinois chapter of American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I want to thank you all for coming to this, our research connection. To me, research is, some people call it like the pillar of everything we do at AFSP. And when I think about the role that research plays in American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I really see it more as like the roots of a tree. And so everything that we do at American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, our education programs, our advocacy efforts, our support for suicide loss survivors, all of that is built upon research. Everything we do at AFSP comes out of the research that people like Dr. Geoffroy do for us. So it is really the backbone of the organization. It's how we have been able to make progress in this fight against suicide. It is what has given us many of the current treatment protocols that we have, things like ketamine, things like CBT therapy, DBT therapy, attachment-based family therapy. These are all things that we promote at AFSP, and they all came out of research. We know these things work because the research proved that out to us. So anyway, just to say that it is a very important pillar, roots, as you would maybe you would say, for the forest of AFSP. So we just want to thank you all for coming. I want to say thank you to all of you who came to the Chicagoland Walk or who are donors at AFSP. It is your support that makes things like this possible. This is exactly what our fundraising dollars go towards, to be able to put on presentations like this for free, open to the public, and that's all thanks to you. And so when we say things like every dollar can make a difference, that's really what we mean. Every dollar can make a difference. That's why we're all here today, and why we're able to invite her to come and speak with us, and why we're able to offer you a nice lunch and really get some information, some education, some fellowship, and really just be together in this fight against suicide. So having said that, I'm going to pass it over to Meg Graff, who is a board member, and she specifically works on this event for us. It's kind of her baby at AFSP, and so she's very proud to be here, and we're very proud to have her, so I'm going to give it to Meg.
Thank you all for coming today. This is one of my favorite days of the year. I love the research connection is a tangible way to show you all where your fundraising dollars go. And I always leave the event with a sense of hope after hearing the newest research and findings that we're able to put together for the latest, most effective treatments for mental health conditions, which lead to fewer suicides. 2 quick notes about today's presentation. Phil, can you raise your hand? Phil is a mental health professional. This subject could be a little sensitive, so if you need to grab him and pull him to the hall, please don't be shy. And Dr. Geoffroy will be taking questions during her presentation, so raise your hands and Angela and I will be around with the mic. And then I want to introduce Dr. Geoffroy. Thank you for coming from Canada. She shares, to share her research on youth bullying and suicide. She is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at McGill University, as well as a researcher at Douglas Mental Health University Institute. She has authored over 80 articles and has received many grants for her work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Geoffroy.
Yes. Hello. So thank you so much for your time, your presence today, and as well I want to thank the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, because back in 2018 I received funding from the IFSP as an early career researcher, and now I'm presenting to you my work funded by the IFSP. Just so you know, I'm doing 2 types of research. First, I'm doing epidemiology, and mostly longitudinal epidemiology. What it means is that I try to produce statistics, to put number on the problematic of suicide. I do that because I want to quantify the extent of the problem and bring the numbers to the policymakers in Quebec, in Canada, to say, look, it's really important, we need to do something about it. And today I will talk more about my epidemiology work, but also I produce intervention research, in a sense that I try to develop intervention at the level of mental health promotion in a way that I try to raise well-being and improve mental health of all children right from childhood, in the overarching aim that this will have an effect later in reducing suicide and distress as well during adolescence. And as well, I want to know that I will talk about statistics. I will quantify the problems, but I just want to just so we are all aware that beyond these numbers, there are real person. They are teenagers, they are children who have experienced psychological distress, who might have made an attempt, died by suicide, with parents, with relatives and friends being affected by this. So just to say that don't hesitate if it triggers distress. We are here to speak about it after, and I can stay as well after the talk to answer more personal questions if you need. And as well, as you notice, I'm Francophone, so I have a strong French accent. So if you don't understand, just don't be shy, raise your hand, and I will repeat, and I will try to make it clearer. And again, if you have questions, you can ask your questions as we go. It makes the presentation more dynamic and interactive. Okay. So I want to start by talking about the epidemiology of youth suicide, as I said, just to re-emphasize the fact that adolescence is a key period for suicide prevention, really. First, because we know that suicide and suicidal ideation and attempts are closely related to mental health distress. And we know that about half of the mental health problems have their first onset during adolescence. So they emerge during adolescence, and 1/3 emerge before the age of 14. So I think this is a good argument saying that we need to invest effort in really helping our adolescents. And we are all concerned as well as now, especially with the pandemic, about youth mental health and youth suicidal risk. But I want to tell you that this concern date back before the pandemic, because these are American data on the prevalence of suicide attempt and suicidal ideation. I'll just go here. In 2009 and 2019, and you can see this is the percentage of youth who have reported an attempt in the past 12 months. So in 2009, it was 6% with an increase to 9% in 2019. And we see the same pattern for suicidal ideation, 11% in 2009 and 19% in 2019. So again, I think that the youth today are experiencing distress and more distress. And I might say that the pandemic hasn't helped the youth. But hopefully, and fingers crossed, as of now, we don't see in the mortality statistics any increase in suicide mortality. But we need to continue the surveillance because we might see an effect later on. But as of now, there is no increase in suicide mortality during the pandemic. But what we've seen, and these are data from Quebec, but we see the same patterns in different countries, like in France, we see that in the US as well, that the effect of the pandemic is really an increase in emergency visits among adolescents, and especially girls. So here is emergency visit for suicidal ideation among 10 to 19 years old in Quebec, and you see the green line for girls, there is a sharp increase in 2021. And then we see as well the same pattern of increase for emergency visit for suicide attempt. So what does it mean? It can mean different things. It can mean that youth are experiencing more distress because we see as well an increase in depression, increase in anxiety during the pandemic. It can also reflect that youth are more aware now because of all the campaign. They are more aware of mental health. They have more mental health literacy. They are better positioned to go seek help at the hospital. So this can be also a positive effect. And although it might reflect, and this is for Quebec, and you tell me if it's the same situation in the US, but we lack services for youth outside the hospital, and this was really evident during the pandemic. So when you have nowhere else you go seek services at the hospital. So I don't have a clear answer about why we see this pattern. I think that those three hypotheses might be true. So more distress, more help-seeking behaviors, and not enough services outside the hospital for youth mental health. So suicide, I think, remain like I'm sure you're all convinced about this, like a source of concern. It's the second cause of mortality in young people. Again, these data from Canada, but it's the same pattern everywhere. So accident is first after suicide, and suicide comes before cancer. Suicide is responsible of 20% of deaths among young people. But these are just like another perspective on the problematic of youth suicide. If we look at suicide across the life course in boys, in men and women, so women are in green and men in blue. So what we see is that so this is for Quebec, like suicide in 10 to 14 years old, like there were no suicide in 2019, but then suicide appear in adolescence with more men than women, and then after that, like suicide is more prevalent among middle-aged men. So it's a frequent cause of death among young people, but suicide in fact affect, like if we look at the life course perspective, more adult than young people. But the pattern is completely different if we look at emergency visit and hospitalization. Across the life course, it's really the youth who are seeking more help for suicidal ideation and attempts, and more girls as well than boys. You see here the patterns for 15 to 19 years old. You might have seen this before. This is the iceberg model of suicide, because I've talked about suicide mortality. It's the peak of the iceberg. And then suicide ideation and attempt requiring emergency visit or hospitalization. But beyond this, and it's why I want to talk to you about this today, is there are many more young people who might experience suicidal ideation, who have made an attempt without seeking help, and sometimes without like talking to a parent, to a friend, to a school teacher about it. And it's really, in my research, what I want to quantify is this. Okay, we know suicide mortality, we know emergency visit, but how many youth are suffering in silence? I think just to say that, and you'll see that the proportion of youth who have made a suicide attempt or report suicidal ideation without seeking help is much more higher than what we see for hospital presentation, and hopefully those kids like are still alive in adulthood. They won't like necessarily die by suicide, and this is a good news. But at the same time, we know that youth who have made a suicide attempt during adolescence, they are more likely to experience distress while in adulthood. And this, what I do in some of my research with one of my colleagues, is that we try to follow in the long term youth who have made an attempt during adolescence, how they are doing in adulthood. And we see in this, there are a lot of research about this, that they are more likely to experience persistent mental health problems, more likely to experience health problems, violence, and as well like to have like lower income. So this, I think to me, this is just a red flag saying that we really need to help teens who have made an attempt, who have like experienced distress in adolescence, because this can have as well an impact later on in adulthood. So if we increase the preventive effort, maybe we can also improve their life trajectories. Now, what I have done in my research is that I have tried to quantify the extent of which teenagers were experiencing suicidal ideation and suicide attempt, like before reaching the age of 20 years. And to do that, I've used a longitudinal cohort where we repeatedly ask questions to teenagers about, have you ever seriously thought about suicide, and have you tried to attempt suicide? So we ask the teenagers those questions at age 13, 15, 17 and 20 years. And using this, we were able to compute a lifetime statistics. So what's the prevalence of ideation and attempt by age 20? And what we found in this study is that the lifetime prevalence by age 20 was 17% for serious suicidal ideation, and that the prevalence was higher in girls, so 20% of girls reported serious thoughts about suicide before reaching the age of 20 years, and 13% of boys. So it's what we found, so this is quite elevated. We also calculated the prevalence for suicide attempt by age 20, and it was 7%. So 7% of teenagers have reported having made a suicide attempt before the age of 20, and again, more girls, 9%, than boys, 4%. And so this is not my it's not a study I conducted, but I think it's important if we talk about youth suicide, it's important as well to talk about non-suicidal self-injury because it's closely related. So what is non-suicidal self-injury is defined as the deliberate self-inflicted damage to body tissue without a suicide intent, okay? And there is a study, it's a systematic review and meta-analysis. So in that study, the authors just try to identify all studies that have calculated prevalence of an SSI, and they found that the rate was 17.2% among adolescents, 13.4% in young adulthood, so it's still prevalent among young adults, and 5.5% in adults. Although it's not the same than a suicide attempt for different reasons, it's still a red flag. Because an SSI, the goal is really to change an emotional state. In the fact that most teens, they will arm themselves often with a sharp object close to the wrist because they are doing that because they want to decrease a painful emotional state. So they want to feel better. And but some of them also do that to signal to others distress, because often it's they can arm themselves on body parts that are visible to others, so it's a way to signal distress, or to self-punishment as well. So they really want to change the emotional state. It's quite prevalent, and the age of onset is earlier than suicide attempt. There is a study in the States that have estimated the percentages of an SSI among children 9 to 10 years old, and the prevalence was about 10%. And the suicide attempt, though the goal is different, is death and the end of the emotional state. The prevalence is lower, and the age of onset is later. But still, although the intention in an SSI is not to make a suicide attempt, I think it deserves some attention, because it's a strong risk factor for later suicide attempt. So those who have used an SSI, they are more likely in the future to make a suicide attempt.
He would kind of cut himself. I would always try to encourage my sister to get some help for him, but she always thought it was nothing. So are you saying that eventually when you are self-injuring, it could lead to suicide later in life?
It increased risk. It's statistics, so it's a red flag. It increased risk for later suicide attempt or distress. But an SSI, although again the intention is not to make an attempt, I think it's signal distress, and it's a negative way of coping with emotion. There are other ways to cope with negative emotion, and I think I'd encourage seeking help for this, especially if it's repeated over time. And the good news about this is that we have treatment that are efficient to reduce an SSI. Mindfulness, dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't know if I've answered your question, but we can talk if you want after in details. Okay? So because in the study we collected longitudinal data, so we have repeated information, what I want to do as well in my research is try to understand the development. How does it develop? When it emerges? When it peaks? So these are trajectories of the prevalence of ideation in attempt like over time. And the blue line here, it's like for both men and women, because and both like females and males, so the red and the green line, they follow like a similar trajectory. So in Quebec, like using recent data, what we see is that the prevalence of ideation, suicidal ideation, really increase towards adolescence and remain high at age 23. So, but these are recent data, and I might say that our data point at age 23 was during the pandemic. So, but in other studies with less recent data, the pattern we see is that suicidal ideation like peak around mid-adolescence and then decrease. But this is like a pattern observed like using like data set dating a few years ago. And for suicide attempt though, here what we see is that the prevalence of suicide attempt peak in adolescence, like around age 15, and then it decreases with the transition to adulthood, and this reflects the patterns we see in the emergency visit. Remember the chart, emergency visit across the life course, we see it's more prevalent in adolescence than adulthood. So the trajectories I've just shown you is just like one trajectory for a population. And I think a way as well to move toward the personalization of care is to stop studying youth who have made a suicide attempt, who have experienced suicidal ideation as one group. In a sense that they might have like different pattern, different profile, they might follow a different trajectories, and those trajectories might be associated with different risk factor that may lead to different intervention. So this is the type of research I'm doing. It's not easy to do because we need longitudinal data. We need to keep asking the same question over time and follow the youth over time, over several years. And we need large population to do that because it remains, from a statistical point of view, suicide attempts remain rare and it's difficult to study. So this is a study I've done using Canadian data. And in that data set, we had information on suicide attempt starting at age 12, and as well the last data point was at age 23. And we use a statistical modeling called group-based trajectories to identify different profiles of teenagers who have made a suicide attempt. And we identified 3 profiles using that data, and those data as well were collected like more than 10 years ago. First, we found that 96% of youth never made a suicide attempt, which is a good news. And then we found that 4% have made a suicide attempt before age 23, but that they were splitting into 2 groups. The first group is adolescents limited, the green line. So those youth had high risk of making a suicide attempt during adolescence, like around age 14, 15, so it peaks there, and then their risk of making another suicide attempt decrease, and like in early adulthood, none were making a suicide attempt again. And then we found a persisting group, the blue line. So 2% in that group. And those youth had like high risk of making a suicide attempt in adolescence, and that risk remained high with the transition to adulthood, okay? What is interesting for prevention here is that the risk factors were not the same. Those who have made a suicide attempt only adolescents with low risk of making another suicide attempt in adulthood, they were more girls, more likely to have depressive symptoms, like before adolescence, so in late childhood, and more likely to have like a mother, and it could be a father as well, but it's just that we had like in many studies only data on a mother with depressive symptoms, which means that it was more a profile related to depression, like maybe a genetic vulnerability for depression and early manifestation of depression. But those who have made repeated suicide attempts over time, so the persisting trajectories, there were no sex difference. They were the same number of boys and girls. And those kids were more likely to have been exposed to suicide in their environment. And then this is epidemiology. So epidemiology were really good to collect data on large population sample, to conduct longitudinal studies as well, but we're not very good into getting detailed information. So it's not clear which exposure to suicide it is, but it can be exposure to suicide in the family or at school or among relatives. But it was a risk factor for belonging to these trajectories. And ADHD as well. So kids were more likely to be identified as having attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So I find this work important because this is telling you that we need to stop studying youth who have made an attempt like as a one group, but like that beyond the numbers, there are different groups following different trajectories, and this, I think, deserve like more attention. Yes?
Depressive symptoms for girls were, no, that's for adolescents limited, right?
Yes. Yeah. So teenagers who belonged like to the profile adolescents limited, they were more likely to be girls with symptomatology of depression. But this means that in terms of ratio, the odds of belonging to the persisting trajectories were 8 times more elevated than those who were exposed to suicide. This is the statistics. Yes, sorry, yeah. But it's a big risk factor. Okay. So I've talked about adolescents, and I think, as I said, it's important to study adolescents, but I think it's also important to study children. They don't, like in Canada, the rate of suicide in children is almost inexistent, but what we see is that an increase in emergency visits for suicide in children. These are just American data to show you that over the last few years, there were an increase in hospital visit for children aged 5 to 9 to 10 to 14. So this is like becoming a problem and a source of concern, and we have like almost no information about this. And say, although yes, and I think it's again, it's not to create concern, but more to create awareness around the fact that it can start before adolescence, and we have almost no information about this because we didn't thought that children can have suicidal ideation, and like I know that in Quebec, like the coroner were quite hesitant to identify a suicide in children as a suicide because they thought like, oh, but suicide, they don't really understand, children don't really understand suicide. They don't understand what death means. So there is little research about this, and as well it's difficult as well to study for different reasons. But just so to talk about like understanding of death. What is understanding of death? First question, and then can children understand death? At what age do we start to understand what death means? So we know that, like just to simplify, that there are 3 characteristics that can indicate that a child has a mature understanding of death. The first one is irreversibility. So this means that the death, they can come back. For instance, I know in Walt Disney, there are many stories of princesses that they just come back after receiving a kiss for a prince. But understanding irreversibility is that the death, like, it is final. We cannot come back to life. And then cessation of biological function, that the heart stops beating, the lungs breathing, and the brain thinking. And this is when the child really understands that, a dead person cannot laugh, cannot think, cannot talk. It's just, yeah. And then universality is that we were all going to die someday. So these are the three characteristics of a mature understanding of death. So at what age do you think that a child can understand this? I'm asking you. 10, 3, 4, 5, 7? You're good. Yes, it's really difficult to put a number, but I will tell you the number I've read in the scientific literature, but it's about 4 to 6. But it's difficult because it depends. It depends of life experiences. If a child has lost a pet or grandparents, then the child might understood earlier the death, or if a child has like higher cognitive abilities, like more intelligent, but I don't like this word. I'll say cognitive abilities as well. It's easier to understand that earlier. And there is as well like a myth that children with suicidal ideation, in fact, they don't understand that. You know, they say they think about suicide, but in fact, they don't understand. And there is just one study. It's an American study about this. And in that study, it was a study on preschooler with major depressive disorders. And in that study, there were 3 groups. So groups of preschoolers with depression and suicidal ideation, who reported suicidal ideation, preschooler with major depression but no suicidal ideation, and like we call them like LT control, but like children in the community with no depression and suicidal ideation. But in fact, in the study, children with suicidal ideation and major depressive disorders, they understood death and the component of death earlier than others. So yes, so children understand that, but in fact they only understand, according to one research, I'm just like, you need to take what I'm telling you with a grain of salt, because I'm relying on a few numbers of studies, okay, to tell you what I'm telling you. But there is one study that tried to put a number at the age that children can understand the word suicide, and it was age 10. But they can understand words like killing yourself, but the word suicide is later. But this is one study conducted a long time ago, in the 19s. So as I told you, the part of my job is to create statistics, like reliable statistics, and estimate to put a number on the extent of the problem. And then this is recent, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis I've conducted with my colleague, try to quantify the prevalence of suicidal ideation, suicide plan, and suicide attempt in children aged 6 to 12 in the community. So this is a study, just the community. We excluded like clinical studies, like children, let's say, with a psychiatric condition or in hospital. It was in the community. So what we have done here is that we try to identify all the studies as the best as we can with limitation, because this is still difficult to do, but we try to identify using a specific search terms the studies that have been published and where they report like a prevalence, a frequency for suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts. And what we found is that 7.5% of children before age 12 have reported suicidal thought or death wishes. So it's not that clear from the study what is a suicidal thought, active suicidal thought, I'm like actively considering suicide, versus a passive death wish, I will be better off dead. So it's not clear. So what is the meaning of this? But it's the number we have. And then plans of suicide, which is like, so it's children who have made a plan to attempt suicide, it was 2.2%. And the suicide attempt, 1.3%. Still, I think I was like surprised by these numbers. I was not expecting this, honestly. Yeah, but this is what we got. Yes.
Can I ask a clarifying
Yes.
question? It's
Yeah.
Angela.
Yeah.
I'm paying really close attention. So this was a study done with the general community
Yes.
of children.
Yes.
And you excluded children who were already diagnosed with a major
Yes.
mental health condition and or were hospitalized.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted
Because
to
we're
clarify.
doing the study on clinical population now.
Gotcha. Okay. I just
And
wanted
it's
to
more,
clarify.
as you can imagine, is more elevated.
No, it's kind of shocking to see these numbers, so I
It
wanted to get
is,
that clarifying
it
point.
is.
Yep.
Yep, yes.
Done in Canada, right?
No, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis all around the world, but most studies, they come from the US.
But you did this meta?
I done this.
Okay.
Yes.
So like what's a ballpark, like how many, what was like the number, example?
There were 28 studies identified and 80,000 children included in those, like 28 studies. Most come from the US.
Okay, that's,
There is one wonderful study in the US called ABCD. They have like, I think, 10,000 children, and it was recently published, and they have measured suicidation plans and SSI attempt in children 9 to 10 years old, just so you know. And our percentages quite align with I think the best study on the topic of children's suicide, the ABCD cohort.
Okay.
Yes.
I wrote that down, thank you. That's
Yeah, and it just email me after as well. I'm happy to share publication. So this is the big number, but what we do in the meta-analysis as well, we try to identify, okay, are the numbers changing depending of some characteristics? And then we've looked at the reference period. So are we talking about current suicidal ideation or lifetime suicidal ideation and attempt? But we didn't find any differences in the prevalence, like statistical differences. But in fact, like the percentages were like slightly higher for studies looking at lifetime. And this is, I think, important. There was from English, a difference according to informers. And this is important because the prevalences of suicidal ideation was higher for studies who interview or like administer questionnaire to children versus the parents. It was 10.9% for studies like questioning the children versus 4.7% in children questioning the parents. And this is again shocking, but not surprising because there's, again, it's a US study, and in the study they found that about 50% of parents, they were not aware that the teenagers were thinking about suicide. So why is that? And this is, I think, yes, many reasons for that. And one reason, I think, it's the obstacle for communication. It's not easy to talk about suicide. How do we talk about suicide? How do we ask the question? Not easy. And as well, on the children's side, they might be as well afraid to worry their parents. They also have obstacle on their side. Assessment method, so the percentages were a bit more elevated in studies like using questionnaires. So it's less precise. Study with questionnaires, sometimes they assess, most of the time, ideation with one question. Have you thought of killing yourself? This is not really specific, and it's subjective to interpretation. And the prevalences were lower in studies that have used interviews, like let's say a clinical psychologist or mental health professionals interviewing children. There were no sex differences. And this is important because in adolescence, it's really clear, like more girls than boys are experiencing suicidal ideation, but in childhood, no sex differences. And again, the finding is aligned as well with other studies. Some studies, they found higher prevalences in boys than girls in childhood. Other, no sex differences, but here, no. Yeah.
I think I remember a study that basically suggested that adolescent males cover it up and hide it more than females do, so I'm going to try to find it in there.
No,
That's probably related.
Yes.
You know, like maybe for some reason it's harder to talk about it if you're a teenage boy than if you're a teenage girl.
Yeah.
It's not hard for all teenagers, but that's just...
Yeah, I buy this argument. Yes.
Right, it's like society and you've got to be a man and all that.
No, yeah. So it's likely.
Depends on their upbringing and cultural.
Yeah. But as well, like before puberty, there are differences like in the like depression. The sex differences in depression, they appear after puberty. Yes. And the country, so there were no differences among country. We have North America, mostly US, Europe, and Asia. The prevalences was the same. And then we've conducted meta-regression, but this is another statistics to look at subgroup differences. And we found an age effect in the sense that the prevalences was higher in older children than younger children, which makes sense. There were no differences in study quality because we combined like 28 studies together. Some were of poor quality, other of higher quality with a large sample, like using interviews and so on, but there were no effect of study quality and no effect of year of publication as well. Like older studies, they produce the same prevalences than higher studies, more recent studies. I didn't expect this though, because we see in the recent years like an increase in hospital visit for suicidal ideation and attempt in children. Now I've presented again like statistics for the community, but I just want to say that there are inequalities in mental health and in suicide among different groups like sex and gender, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, and abuse of neglect are some example where kids with like certain belonging to certain group, they are like more at risk of ideation and attempt. And this, again, it's data from Quebec. And we just look at the prevalences of ideation according to different sexual orientation. And without going into details, just so, but it's known, but I think, although it's known, it's still important to produce statistics for the policymaker so they can do something. But yes, the prevalences of ideation was higher in kids who were not identify themselves as exclusively heterosexual, prevalence much more higher in bisexual teenagers, very important as well. And this is just a study where we requested funding to continue this study, but what we want to do is try to identify protective factors. What can we do? Our social support, protective, acceptation toward, of the diversity by the teacher, by the parents, try to reduce like this shocking numbers. Okay, now I will talk about bullying. Bullying victimization, it's a part of my research that I'm doing like for a few years, and it is the part as well that's mostly funded by AFSP. So it's because of AFSP that I was able like to conduct those studies and to start my career as well as an early researcher back then. And I think it's really important when we talk about suicide prevention, it's important to talk about bullying victimization because it's a big risk factor and we can do something about it. This is the good news. So it's just a slide, but it's not a surprise that there is a lot of media attention toward the connection between bullying and suicide, like everywhere around the world, in Canada, in the US, in Quebec, in Europe. So there is a connection in the media, and I've tried as well. It was my starting point to conduct my research. So what do we know, in research, in science, looking at the data? So what is bullying? And I'll use the word bullying and victimization as interchangeably. But what is bullying is that I think when we see bullying, we all recognize what is bullying, but in fact, there are different definitions of bullying, and some researchers disagree between the what is bullying, what is peer victimization, but I will make it simple. Let's talk about bullying victimization. So what it is, it's an aggressive behaviors that is deliberate, that is repeated over time, that implies a power imbalance. So these are just the three characteristics that were put forward by a researcher like Dan Holhus, who is known as the father of bullying research, and also as negative consequences for the victim. So these are the characteristics, but I think they, a bullying can, a behaviors can be labeled as bullying without this. Because what is a power imbalance is a bit difficult to assess. It can be an imbalance based on age, based on sex, based on strength, based on numbers as well, or abilities, repeated. Yes, it's a behavior that is repeated, but can just one bullying behavior can be very harmful. It's just like one behavior is, let's say, online. It doesn't always have to be repeated. And deliberate, yes, but some, I think, bully child, they're not always aware of the consequences of the action. So it's not a surprise. Bullying, it's not rare. It's prevalent. These are just statistics around the world, but yes, in Canada is here, the US is here, a bit lower. It's around, it depends of the study, but let's say between 10 to 20% of children who have been exposed to bullying victimization. And the attention towards bullying just, I think, came recently, because before we thought that, okay, bullying, it's like a normal rite of passage. It will make the child stronger. But in fact, it's not really the case. It's like peer abuse, and it can have long-term consequences. And there are different types of bullying. It can be verbal, like name-calling, threatening, ridiculing in front of others, mocking. It can be physical, hitting, pushing, pinching, stealing, social, relational, speaking ill of someone behind their back, spreading rumors, exercising control, excluding or encouraging others to exclude. And it can be cyber as well, so it can occur online, like harassing someone through messages or call, sharing, ridiculing, or insulting content on social media. So these are the 4 types of bullying victimization, and it changed with age. In childhood, for instance, it's more physical bullying that will occur, and it's easier for teachers to observe it. And as well, there's just one teacher, one main teacher, and then they can see it, they can intervene. But as the children grow older, they become better with language and expressing themselves, so it will be less physical. It's switched for social, relational, verbal, and this is really subtle. It's difficult for a teacher to identify, let's say, relational bullying, let's say identifying teenagers who have been excluded for a group, or the target of rumors. It's not that easy. And cyber, we'll come back to cyberbullying. I have statistics on cyberbullying. I forgot to say as well that these are categories, but they are overlap. Like, for instance, teenagers who are a victim of cyberbullying, about 50% are also victim of other form of bullying. So they usually goes together, and let's say that a form of bullying can start online, on social medias, and then continue at school, face-to-face. So it's interconnected. This is another trajectory studies, because it's what we do in my research group. We have access to longitudinal data. And here again, the idea was to identify heterogeneity in exposure to bullying victimization, starting from age 6 in that study. So at age 6 in Quebec, it's the age at children enter, they are in kindergarten. It was the end of the year. Up until age 13, where they are in high school. So what are the different patterns of exposure to bullying victimization? And we found 3 groups in the study. We found that 26.2% of children, they belong to the low trajectory. So they were rarely exposed to a form of bullying victimization, in that study. 59.3% moderate, but it's not necessarily severe, because in that study we use a scale with 7 items. Have you haven't been like physically attacked by someone? Have you been the victim of mocking? So it's not necessarily severe, but what it means that, you know, it's kind of typical to be exposed to some form of bullying victimization over time. And just to reassure you right now that this trajectory was not associated with mental health problems. But then there were trajectories 14.5%, the green one. So those children were at higher risk of being the victim of others starting from kindergarten. And this just continued during childhood. And although it decreased a little bit around like 9, 10, as children like, again, acquire more social skills, it still remains high. So what this is telling me is that, yes, okay, we need to be able to better spot, like, children will be at higher risk of being exposed to the more severe bullying victimization right from kindergarten, because it doesn't like appear out of the blue. Those who were bullied like in adolescence, they maybe were also bullied while in kindergarten. And so who are at risk of being the target of bullying? More boys. The children were more aggressive and impulsive. Children as well were more likely to be like abused or neglected by their parents, chaotic families, diverse youth, minorities. But this again are statistics, you know. But I think that there are many youth as well who might be the victim of others without any risk factors, like. But those are more at risk. But it can as well, it can happen to everyone. So what are the associations now between bullying and suicidal ideation and attempt? So in one study, we found that kids were exposed to chronic bullying victimization, so repeated form of victimization over time. They were more likely to report suicidal ideation or suicide attempt in adolescence, and the odds ratio were large, like these are like 5 to 6 times. So this is a strong risk factor, and this is after controlling as well for confounding factors. What are confounding factors? Is that like some characteristics that might increase the chances of being bullied and victimized by others are also associated with the chances of thinking about suicide or making an attempt. Like, for instance, mental health problems. Kids were more aggressive, impulsive, we've seen it, or even like experiencing depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. These are risk factors for suicide attempt, but also for bullying victimization. So in science, we really want to make sure to control for these characteristics to reduce the possibility of reverse causation, like in effect that this association might reflect prior vulnerabilities, but it was not the case. In that study, we see this pattern of association after taking into account vulnerability factors. This is a study on cyberbullying, cyber victimization that I've done with my PhD student, who will be soon a doctor because she's having her thesis defense on November 24, so I'm very proud of her. But anyway, so in that study, we've tried to look at whether cyberbullying was more strongly associated to suicidal risk than face-to-face bullying. Because we are concerned about cyberbullying. Why are we concerned? I think there are 3 characteristics that make us concerned. First, it can occur 24/7. Like all the time, children are carrying their phone. It never stops. For face-to-face bullying, you know, when you're back home, you're safe home, then it stops. But cyberbullying, it can occur all the time, so never stop. And then second, it gives access to a large audience with the potential of becoming viral. You're not exposed to humiliation in front of a small group, like in the schoolyard, for instance, but no, like 100,000 of other person can like observe the humiliation. And third, there are a proportion of children who don't know who are the perpetrators. So it's really difficult to intervene and make it stop if you don't know who is the perpetrator. But just so you know, most of the time the perpetrators are kids attending the same school. But it's mostly when we look at cyberbullying in childhood, let's say age 12, then children are less likely to know the perpetrator. But for teenagers, mostly it's kids attending the same school, and young children are more a victim of an anonymous perpetrator. So in this study, this is just cross-sectional association in the sense that we look at being victimized right now and chances of reporting ideation and attempt right now. And what we found, we've looked at association at age 15 and 17, and just like without like understanding all of these numbers, what we found is that yes, children or adolescents were a victim of cyberbullying. They were more likely to report ideation and attempt than those exposed to face-to-face only. So cyberbullying in the short term carried like higher risk for suicide ideation and attempt alone or when combined with face-to-face victimization. So yes, so this is a study. It's not my study. It's the study conducted by by Klomek and colleagues, and using the data from the 1981 Finnish birth cohort. But in that studies is just they've looked at whether bullying victimization was associated with more severe form of suicide-related outcomes. Here they combine hospitalization with suicidal death. Can, like using research data, can being bullied be associated with hospitalization and suicidal death? But just so you know, in that study, the pattern of association reflect more hospitalization for suicide attempt than suicidal death, because there were few suicide because it's at age 25. So just rapidly, they found, yes, that being frequently bullied at age 8 was associated in boys and girls, and more strongly in girls, with a higher likelihood of being hospitalized for a suicide attempt or dying by suicide after controlling again for childhood characteristics that can confound the effect. So this is one study we have. And then we have another study conducted by, the study was supervised by a colleague of mine, Louise Arsenault. And in that study, they have used the 1958 British birth cohort. It's a birth cohort of about almost 20,000 persons born in 1 week in March 58. And now the participants are still in contact with the researchers. So using that cohort, we're able to study like long-term effect. And in that study, Louise look at whether like being bullied frequently in childhood, it was at age 7 and 11, as reported by the mother, was associated with ideation in midlife, like at age 45, suicidal ideation. And yes, she found that frequent bullying in childhood was associated with 1.7 the odds of reporting suicidal ideation at age 45. So a persisting, a long-term effect that was found in that study, again controlling the best as we can. It's not causation studies, or it's like observational studies, but controlling the best as we can for confounding factors. And then again, this is a recent study funded by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We've used the same cohort, the 1958 British birth cohort, but in the cohort we identify using death certificate the suicide. And the idea is that is being bullied in childhood be associated with higher likelihood of dying by suicide by age, the year was by age 50. And yes, we found that, but this just so you know, it's a very difficult study to conduct because we're linking prospectively collect information during childhood with death certificate in adulthood, and suicide is rare. So it's difficult to study. But yes, we found evidence that yes, bullying in childhood, as reported by the mother using one single question back in the 60s, was associated with higher likelihood of dying by suicide later on. when no other factors were considered. But when we start like making our statistical adjustment for other factors, you know, the association was lost. But what this is telling us is that, yes, I think child bullying as other non-risk factor for suicide, that childhood bullying can be considered, you know, as a there are evidence to say that, yes, child bullying is associated with ideation, attempt in adolescence, hospitalization for suicide attempt, suicide ideation in midlife, and even like suicide mortality. But yes, it's, we have ways to act on suicide bullying, on bullying, and to prevent it. Okay, now again, I'm just like, I will explain other studies funded by the AFSP, and now we're moving more towards like a biological explanation, because I will just repeat. Okay, yes, we found an association between childhood bullying and later suicidality, but why? And there are many different reasons as of why that we can study in research. And with the help of the AFSP, we were able to look at whether the long-term association we observed can be explained by biological factors. I will explain what are those biological factors. First, this is part of the thesis of Léa Perret, the doctoral candidate. So first, we know that bullying victimization is associated with suicidal ideation, right, and depressive symptoms and other mental health problems. But we also know that not all bullied and victimized children will develop a suicidal risk or will develop depressive symptoms. So why is that? Can the genetic vulnerability for depressive symptoms, here it's depressive symptoms, can moderate the association in the fact that you might be at higher risk of thinking about suicide if you have been bullied or victimized, if you are genetically predisposed for mental health problems. And in that study, we look at, we look at what the genetic vulnerability for depression make adolescents more at risk of developing depressive symptoms or suicidal ideation. So we've looked here, we have three findings here to share. So first, the one, we found that genetic predisposition to depression was associated with depression and suicidal ideation, so which makes sense. So if you are genetically predisposed for depression, you will be more likely to develop a depression and suicidal ideation during adolescence. And then she also found that bullying victimization was associated with genetic predisposition to depression. So this means that this might suggest that the genes that make you like vulnerable for depression can also make you vulnerable for bullying victimization. And then she found that yes, bullying victimization was associated with depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation, but that the association was not moderate by genetic vulnerability for depression, which means that like taking into account the genetic risk for depression, bullying was associated with depressive symptoms anyhow, in a sense that we don't find that those with a genetic vulnerability were more likely to develop depression and suicidal ideation after being bullied. There was no moderation effect by the genetic predisposition. The second question we've asked is, okay, we see a long-term association between bullying victimization and depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation that can persist up to midlife. Why is that? Is this because of epigenetics modification? So epigenetics refer to the dynamic change around DNA which can influence the expression of genes such as DNA methylation. Here the question is that is being bullied can influence the way that our gene will express themselves, you know, and then increase the risk for suicidal ideation. So we tested two hypotheses. First, is whether the association was explained by a modification in the epigenetic marker of stress response, reactivity. So this is the epistress, and whether it was explained by epigenetic marker related to biological aging. Biological aging is that we all have an age, but some people, like depending of the age, they might look like older than their clinical age. So this is like biological aging. And why we look at biological aging is that there are like scientific evidence showing that yes, like adversity can accelerate aging, that exposure to adversity can also be associated with more mental health problems and suicidal ideation. So we've looked at those hypotheses, try to understand why do we see this persisting association between bullying in childhood and ideation attempt in later life. So what we found is that none of the biological markers were not associated with peer victimization. So in that study, and with all the limitation as well we experienced, like bullying victimization was not associated with biological markers. And then we found that, yes, epigenetic agings and epigenetic response to reactivity they were not associated with suicidal ideation. We found some evidence that it's associated with depressive symptoms, but it was not that consistent. And then, not surprisingly, we didn't find that the biomarker did not explain the association that we see that persists between bullying victimization and depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. So we need to continue working and try to identify other mediators. So why do we see that? And when we identify those mediators, then it can raise awareness on intervention. This is just like a few years ago, I just came across this book like by chance, and I was like attracted by the cover, like Restez fort, it means like stay stronger, and the picture. And then I opened the book and I just realized that it's a diary from a teenager who died by suicide following bullying, and the diary was found by her parents, and the parents decided to publish the diary to bring awareness. And I find that is very powerful to illustrate the suffering associated with bullying and the obstacle as well for communication. So I will try to read the best as I can the two different passages. Okay, the first passage is in the book. She said that so it was like the lunchtime at school, at high school, and she remained locked in the bathroom, not to be, to experience like negative behaviors from others. And now she explained what she has to do when going out of the bathroom. She said 10 meters of courtyard, 176 steps, and a hallway separated us from the classroom. This journey for me was like an obstacle course, dodging blows, tripping and spitting, close your ears to insult and mockery, watch your bag and your hair, all back tears again and again during these infinite minutes. So, this is an illustration of all the suffering that this young lady could have experienced, and this young girl has many others. And then the contrast is when she described what happened when she come back home. The mother asked her, "How was your day?" We all do this. "How was your day?" And she said, and you'll see her answer. How are you doing, my dear? How was your day?" My mother asked me as she hugged me. "Fine." She said in her diary, I had decided not to tell anyone about the hell I was going through in high school for several reasons. First, I didn't want them to worry. And finally, I knew they will go to the principal, the director, and tell him. And I knew that it will make the situation worse. I think this illustrates like the fact that we have like teenagers that might suffer, and they might experience suicidal ideation, they might be victim of severe bullying at school and don't tell anyone for several reasons. So now I just want to tell you that this is backed up by research I won't like, I know we just have like 15 minutes left. And just so you know that in research, yes, it's known that some teenagers, they won't tell about bullying victimization, neither to the teacher, neither to their parents. So now for the rest of the time, I just want to talk about protective factors to finish on a more positive notes, and we can, take time to think together of, okay, what can we do about this now? Okay. Just to give you a highlight, so yes, I'm doing epidemiology research. I study risk factor, but I try as well to invest energy in my research to study protective factors. And then I've been awarded recently with a Quebec fund to create a research team from different universities in Quebec just to study protective factors. And I think it's important because we spend a lot of time studying risk factors, but yes, what about protective factors? What about intervention to promote mental health? So I study different risk factors in my research. This is just an example, like social support, and I will show you statistics about this because I think this is really promising. Civic engagement. Are you to engage in the society, do volunteer work? Is this protective for them? Green space as well, the connection with nature, physical activity as well, physical activity in nature, and the training of mental health professionals as well. So how we can better equip people at school, people working clinically to better identify suicidal risk and intervene. So this is a study on social support where we've looked at whether teenagers who report higher level of social support, is this protective? And the quick answer is yes. And after, again, all the statistical control to make sure that social support is really a protective factors, yes, we found that teenagers who reported higher level of social support had a reduced risk of ideation and attempt by 50%. And this is observational studies based on epidemiology cohort, but we see as well a very unique intervention that aim to raise social support that has an effect on reducing suicidal ideation and attempt. And again, this is a study controlling for mental health because, I just want to tell you this because I think it's important, there is again a reverse causation effect in a sense that teenagers with less mental health problems, they're more likely to have more social support. And those with more mental health problems, while they need more social support, they have less. Because, kids prefer often like hang out. They might prefer, not all the time, some might prefer like hang out with teenagers like who are not in distress. But just to say that, yes, we need to be there to show to others in our surrounding that we're there for them, and especially those who experience distress, although it's not always easy to be there and to be supportive over time, it can make a difference. It's quite important. And this is another study on social support. This is a Korean study. Here we use a Korean cohort, and we've looked at whether Korean teenagers were victims of others and non-victims, whether they were protected by support from friends. And the answer in this study, again, is yes. And in fact, the protective effect of social support was higher among teenagers who were victims from others than non-victims. So the message is that, yes, social support is helping everyone, but it's helping more teenagers who are vulnerable and who are the victim of others. So again, this is a protective factors that we can try to act on it, try to create like a social network about a teenager who might be victim of others, try to facilitate friendship connection with others. Yes. So yes, again, so this is just to summarize that not all bullied kids will think about suicide. There are protective factors, and the most important one is social support, but there are other studies showing that good nutrition is good, self-esteem, meaning of life, gratitude, compassion, positive self-talk as well. Yes, to make sure as well that the victim don't internalize the victimization. So what we can do, I think, just to be aware, just not to be shy to raise question about bullying, victimization experience. If we identify it, it's a first step, so we can intervene on it. Yes, we might try to stop bullying by intervening with the young bully. Often it's a multimodal intervention. We need to work with the school director, with the teacher, with teenagers attending the school. There are as well school-wide prevention activities that can be implemented. And yes, we can intervene, of course, with the victim to ensure that they don't internalize the effect of repeated bullying. Just so you know that I try to be involved in knowledge transfer. So last year with a colleague of mine, he's a psychiatrist, we wrote an article in The Conversation, and it's a lay article, try to give tips on how parents and kids can have an honest and safe conversation about suicide. Yes, I can. So you can Google it, or if you want, you can also write an email. I can send the link if you want to read it. So it's a resource if you need that can be used. And as well, these are just books. That I like those books. This one, The Power of Validation. So arming your child against bullying, peer pressure, addiction, self-harm is, yes. I think it's a nice book about what can we do. I think a way to break the obstacles for communication is to use validation. It's easy to say, it's not always easy to do, and I think the book is really, hands-on with a lot of examples and illustration. How can we use validation? So yes, so the children and adolescents will be willing then to disclose. And then the other book is Parenting a Teen Who Has Intense Emotion. Again, this is like DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, Inspire. And yes, it's a good book for parents. I like it. And just so to say thank you, merci. Yes, for your invitation, for supporting as well my research.